Thank you so much for that music. Today, as we participate in communion together, I entitled our message Table Fellowship, and I'd like to expound on a theme that I shared in yesterday's newsletter, if you get that. And you might have read it. If you didn't, you'll get a little summary. And if you did read it, you'll get a little repetition, but expansion of what I shared. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, our Cowboy Church speaker last week made mention of him. Mr. Rogers was my first English teacher. I moved to the United States when I was 6 years old and wasn't going to school yet. It was summertime, and one of the things that my uncle did to expose me to the English language, which I had never been exposed to, was sit me in front of the television to watch Mr. Rogers. And back then, he became like my favorite person, but still today, he is one of my favorite people, but for other reasons, as I've gotten to know him better, especially recently through a movie that was made called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, acted by Tom Hanks. Exceptional movie, giving you a window into the character of this man. Fred Rogers was a Presbyterian minister who is best remembered, of course, for his show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which was pioneering and innovative in television for children. Back then, there was this misconception that you have to just entertain children with cartoons and all these other really valueless programs, and Mr. Rogers understood the potential of kids, and if you've watched his show, you know that it is good stuff even for adults, and he just developed great programming for children. My children have watched Mr. Rogers. They do watch Mr. Rogers. And he did many episodes over the many years that he did the show. 865 episodes, in fact. He communicated powerful lessons about how to love our neighbor. And one such episode was controversial and beautiful at the same time. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. 4 months after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rogers invited Francois Clemens, a descendant of slaves and sharecroppers from Birmingham, Alabama, to play the role of a police officer on his show. Now, some people think maybe that was just coincidence, maybe Mr. Rogers, being who he is, just happened to stumble across this situation, but no, actually, those that knew him best say Mr. Rogers was very intentional about everything he did on the show. And Clemens became the first African American with a recurring role on a children's television series. This was innovative. But this was not the controversial part. Rogers was pressing social issues, and he was challenging social conventions of the time in many ways. And one such way had to do with an episode, and this is back in the early 90s, what you see here on the television, but this was a reenactment of an episode that took place in the late 60s between Mr. Rogers and Clemens. This was a few months after Clemens' debut. Rogers invited viewers to be his neighbor as usual as he walked into the house and sang the song. But this time, instead of putting on his coat, he said it was a hot day, and Mr. Rogers proceeded to go outside to put his feet in a pool of cold water. In his front yard, he filled a small plastic pool with water and began to soak his feet. Soon after, Clemens dropped by for a visit, and Mr. Rogers invited him to take off his shoes, take off his socks, and put his feet in the pool with Mr. Rogers. Clemens accepted, did what was asked, rolled up his pant legs and uniform, and placed his very brown feet in the same water as Rogers' white feet. And this may sound like a very small gesture and may even seem insignificant in the world we live in today. But in 1969, what Mr. Rogers did on public television was unimaginable. Because like public fountains, public transportation, and public schools, the public pool had also become a battleground for racial segregation. And even after segregation ended in America, there were still many people in our country that were afraid to enter the water that a black person was in, because there was a misconception, a myth, which today it's hard for us to even wrap our minds around and understand how people could have believed this, but there was the belief during the Jim Crow era that blacks and whites could not swim together because they feared that African Americans carried communicable disease that contaminated the water. Now, whether some people just created that idea in order to maintain segregation, that is debatable, but the truth is the large segment of society believed this, and some of you are probably old enough to remember these times where there was a fear of entering water where blacks had been swimming. And segregation was also in the pool, and Mr. Rogers put his feet in that water with Mr. Clemens that day and communicated to live television to the American people that we should not create such walls. What Mr. Rogers did was shocking and controversial, but in many ways, it is very similar to the early Christian church. And what I mean by that is table fellowship in the first century did not happen between people of various social and racial backgrounds. Jews and Gentiles did not participate in the same table. Slaves and free people did not participate in the same table. There were so many barriers in Roman Greco society, whether it was age, gender, or race. Table fellowship was a very sacred thing. Just like in India today with the caste system, different members of the several castes in India are not supposed to eat together at the same table. And as Westerners, we can sometimes underestimate how important table fellowship was in the ancient world in the first century. But it was because of this that Peter, after baptizing Cornelius, when he arrived in Jerusalem, he was not challenged because he baptized Cornelius. If you read the text in Acts chapter 11, verse 3, the criticism of Peter was, "You went to uncircumcised men and ate with them." Because what Peter did, just like what Mr. Rogers did, was unacceptable. It was socially inappropriate. You don't do that. These were Christians in Jerusalem who found Peter guilty because he shared the same table with people who were not circumcised. Jesus was constantly under criticism because of table fellowship. Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 through 11, And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, these were all Jews, so it wasn't just that you couldn't have table fellowship with other people that were not Jewish. They had to be on the same political platform you were in, if you understand what I mean. And the amazing thing about Jesus, he had table fellowship with people like Matthew and Zacchaeus. They were tax collectors, and a faithful Jew would not eat with tax collectors because table fellowship was a big deal in that time. It meant agreement. It meant fellowship. It meant that you are in harmony with that person. And Jesus was breaking through these barriers in society, much like Mr. Rogers, and saying that he was not going to accept the social norms of the day. Jesus went further. In his group of disciples, among the 12, you had people that could not be further on the opposite end of the political spectrum. When you invite a zealot to be a part of your core group, a zealot was a Jew that believed that you cannot compromise with Rome, but not only can you not compromise with Rome, you can't be passive about it. You have to take matters into your own hands and use the sword to fight Rome. Jesus had a zealot among the 12. On the other end of the spectrum, Jesus had a man named Matthew who was a tax collector, meaning that not only did Matthew compromise with Rome, he was actually working for Rome to collect the unjust and corrupt taxes on behalf of Rome. How in the world are you able to keep a group together, 12 people, when you invite people? You think that Republicans and Democrats have differences? Some of you have not traveled the world. Republicans and Democrats' differences are fundamentally very small compared to some of the differences in other parts of the world. And when you look at ancient history, you look at Judaism in the first century, a zealot and a tax collector could not be further apart within one nation. And yes, we do have differences. We have political differences. And amazingly, we allow our political differences, sometimes even within a household or a family, to compromise table fellowship. Jesus somehow managed to do it. Table fellowship is a powerful thing. In Greco-Roman culture, distinctions of rank and status were recognized at the meal table. How many of you learned table manners growing up? Now, table manners, you're not supposed to put your elbows on the table, right? There are so many others, and different countries have different table manners. In some countries, it is actually very appropriate to slurp. It's actually, or lick your fingers right in front of everybody, right? And even my grandfather was from a country in the Middle East. I'm a quarter Lebanese, and it is very appropriate to burp after the meal. It's kind of like saying, "Thank you, honey, for that beautiful meal." And sometimes when I don't have guests over, I do that, and my kids, it's part of my Lebanese culture, but I don't do it on purpose. It's just, it happens. And that, in some cultures, is considered appropriate. Now, other cultures, it's not. We have a thing called table manners. And in the first century, in Greco-Roman culture, there were table manners. And this applied, in many cases, to Jewish culture. It was not customary for high-status guests to eat at the same table with lower-status guests. That was table manners. The more privileged members received more and better food than poor members. And this is about as shocking to you as the pastor burping at the table, isn't it? Because it's not like your culture, right? I mean, you would never imagine having potluck here at the Sandy Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we have a section of our fellowship hall for people that drive new cars, and a section of the fellowship hall for people that drive older cars. Or maybe a section of the fellowship hall for people that have white-collar jobs, or a section of the fellowship hall for people that have blue-collar jobs, right? That would be repugnant to us, wouldn't it? But that's the way the first century operated in Greco-Roman society. And this brings us to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 to 34. We know that Jesus had the Passover meal with his disciples on Thursday night prior to his crucifixion on Friday. And Jesus ate the bread and he drank the juice, and he pointed to some important lessons related to his death, and we're going to participate in that in just a little while. But other than the Gospels and the accounts of Jesus eating the Passover with his disciples, the 12, the only other place in the entire New Testament that talks about this thing that we call the Lord's Supper is 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 to 34. And we can't understand 1 Corinthians 11 without understanding table manners. Because what Paul was rebuking the Corinthian church for on that day that he wrote the letter was that they were having table manners that was very much in conformity with Greco-Roman culture. And the truth is that what Jesus taught the disciples on that evening when he shared the Passover meal with them was that the table manners of his kingdom were fundamentally different than the table manners of Greco-Roman society. When Paul talks about eating the bread unworthily in 1 Corinthians 11, he is saying that you are eating the bread according to Greco-Roman culture, table manner expectations. Let me just share with you here. We're going to read a few passages from 1 Corinthians 11. I want you to understand this in the context of table manners in the Greco-Roman world. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 18, Paul says, in verse 17, he says, I cannot approve of how you're doing the Lord's Supper. Verse 18, he explains why. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. Now just listen for a moment. Paul is talking about distinctions when he says divisions. Paul's talking about separate tables, divisions. When you come together as a church. Now you know that in the first century, people did not go to church. Did you know that? The church went to homes. Did you know that? Today, we leave our homes and we go to a place we call church, right? Paul would be really scratching his head listening to us talk because there was no such a thing as a place called church that people leave their homes to go to. The church went to worship in homes. You understand what I'm saying? The church is not a building theologically. The church is a group of people. Somehow, in many later centuries, we started using the word church to refer to a building. So when you say we are paying off the church, Paul would be scratching his head and saying, what are you talking about? Because Paul did not see the church as a building. So when he says here, when you come together as a church, he doesn't say when you come together in the church, because the church is who comes together. Are you following? But Paul has an issue with how they're coming together. Now, the church came together every week, and in some cases more than once a week, in homes to study and eat together. That was church. Those were the main ingredients of coming together, the gathering of the people of God. They would study the Word of God, and they would eat. Those were the two ingredients. Paul says, I have an issue with your coming together. He says, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. You think that you are eating the Lord's Supper, but you're not. Because when you come together, there are distinctions among you. He says, for in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What Paul is saying here, often misunderstood, is that we have a problem in the Corinthian church because when you come together as a church, you have two separate tables. One table is so lavished that you eat so much, and Paul is probably exaggerating when he says you get drunk from that table. You know, have you ever been to a table, a buffet, where it was just overwhelming? And have you ever been to a table where you leave hungry? Well, the Corinthian church was practicing the table manners of the Roman world, and Paul says if you eat like the Roman world does, with distinctions among you, then you are not eating the Lord's table, or the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper has been a very misunderstood concept. When Paul refers to the Lord's Supper, he's not talking about a liturgical ritual that some churches do every Sabbath or every Sunday. Some churches do once a quarter, and it's what we're going to do today, which is not wrong because it does help us, remind us of Jesus and what he did for us. But when Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, he's not talking about a liturgical ritual. The Lord's Supper was an actual meal eaten by the community in a private home. It was the equivalent of potluck. Only they would probably eat unleavened bread and participate in drinking grape juice, and they would remember the body of Jesus, and they would remember the blood of Jesus with every bite and with every sip of the cup. That's what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 11. The sharing of the symbolic bread and cup of the Lord's Supper occurred as part of the common meal. God uses common things, such as bread and grape juice, to teach us about spiritual realities. We see that throughout the Old Testament. God used a common thing, such as a lamb sacrificed, to teach us about spiritual realities. Jesus took a common thing, such as bread, and he said, look, this is my body that is broken for you. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 20 to 21. Do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What was happening in Corinth? The poor members of the church, which was the majority, they were being humiliated. Poor people can be humiliated by rich people, even in our world today. But in the first century, it was just the way it was. Wealth was worn on people's sleeves. Wealth was worn in clothing. Wealth was displayed in every possible way. And Paul says it should not be like this among God's people. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 27. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Paul's taking this pretty seriously. Paul's pretty upset about this. For Paul, eating the bread or drinking the juice in an unworthy manner means eating according to Greco-Roman status divisions. Having separate tables for Paul was shocking. And you say, but that was in the first century. Well, not so fast. Separate tables. I'm glad we don't have separate tables here. I'm glad that Filipinos and Hispanics can eat in the same table. We've come a long way, but it wasn't very long ago. And if you've heard of George Knight, he wrote a great little book on Adventist history called Organizing for Mission. And he reminds us in this book that black Adventists in Washington, D.C., up until the 1950s, including those who worked at the General Conference, could not eat at the denominational cafeteria. They couldn't send their children to nearby Washington Missionary College or become a patient at the Washington Missionary Sanitarium. Friends, I want to tell you that based on my reading of 1 Corinthians 11, whoever was running the denomination this way might have been participating in communion according to the liturgical appropriateness that we've learned, but they were eating the bread unworthily because they were causing distinctions. They were reflecting the table manners of American Jim Crow Southern culture, which for Paul would have been an abomination. And that would equate to eating the bread unworthily. If we understand the principle of what Paul was communicating and apply it to our reality. Now today, we've come a long way when it comes to skin color, but what about political divisions? I want to challenge you on this. Do we sometimes have different tables in a very subtle way? Nobody's going to put signs on the tables at a large gathering and say, well, this table here is for Democrats and this table here is for Republicans. But I have observed how political divisions in this country have very subtly created a wedge where we do sit at separate tables. There aren't labels, but they are subtly there. And I'm telling you, if you have allowed political divisions and political opinions to distance yourself from people in your life, you are eating the bread unworthily. And what you're going to do by washing each other's feet, reenacting what Jesus did with the disciples, becomes a dead ceremony. Because the ceremony is intended to be just a shadow of the reality, of the substance. If I discriminate in my heart, I eat the cup and drink the juice in an unworthy manner. And I think we all understand that discrimination can happen in so many ways. Age. We live in a culture today where millennials despise often baby boomers. Baby boomers look with suspicion upon millennials. Those are distinctions that society has created. The church needs to rise above that. What about race, skin color, physical appearance? Well, we've come a long way. But sometimes hiring a person that's overweight or handicapped, are you following? There's a thing called unconscious bias based on negative stereotypes. And we have some negative stereotypes about people who are handicapped, people who are overweight or underweight, tall, short, and they're unconscious. Gender, occupation. In Brazil, where I'm from, it's still pretty obvious. Blue-collared people are treated with less dignity than white-collar people. Jobs like that of a plumber, electrician are not valued in society. They're necessary. They're skill-based jobs. I'm grateful that here in America they are valued. You can become a millionaire in this country as an electrician and a plumber, but in some countries, no matter how hard you work and no matter how well you run your business, you will never amount to much in a blue-collar context because there's a thing called discrimination against blue-collar people. Socioeconomic status, political views, associations, religion. We need to search our hearts. This was the case in the first century. My brothers, James said, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. He said, for if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in, and you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothes and say, hey, you sit over here at this table in a good place with the best food, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, sit down at my feet, and you'll have the crumbs that may fall from the table. Friends, in the Christian church, in the first century, Paul and James both address it. The Christians were beginning to adopt or fall back into, in some cases, Greco-Roman culture table manners. You cannot eat from that bread with Greco-Roman values. You are not eating the Lord's Supper, Paul says. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? So, with that said, it is now time for those that feel impressed and called to do so. We're going to have a reenactment of what Jesus did with the disciples that Thursday evening. He washed their feet. Like Mr. Rogers, Jesus was like a bull in a china shop, destroying the status quo of the day. The leader can serve those under him. So we're going to do the foot washing.